Chapter 21. The Heart of Revolution. Francine and Linda were still seated with Major Amma and Mangino in one of the quieter corners of the command center. The recent discussion about faith and the old world order's twisted plans had worn them thin emotionally, but they had managed to find some calm. Major Amma shared a few humorous anecdotes about her strict upbringing, helping Francine relax, while Mangino chimed in with her no-nonsense perspectives. But the moment Henry and Paul entered the room, the atmosphere immediately changed. The look on their faces told the women that whatever was about to be discussed wasn't going to be good. Paul cleared his throat, his voice steady with an undertone of tension.
Sorry to interrupt, ladies.
Paul turned to Francine and Linda.
But we need to talk to you both. It's important.
Major Amma and Mangino immediately stood, ready to leave, sensing this was a private family matter.
We'll give you some privacy,
Major Amma said.
Come find us if you need anything,
Mangino added. Paul raised his hand.
There's no need for that. Actually, I think you both should stay. You're going to want to hear this too.
Major Amma and Mangino froze briefly, exchanging glances of surprise. It wasn't every day they were invited to stay for what was obviously a serious conversation. Somewhat honored by Paul and Henry's trust, they returned to their seats, now fully tuned in. Linda looked at Henry and Paul, her voice nervous.
What's going on? Is everything okay?
The men hesitated as they exchanged tense glances. They both sighed and turned their attention back to the women. Francine narrowed her eyes, her intuition sharp.
No, it's not. I can see it on your faces. Just tell us what's wrong.
Paul took the lead, his tone deliberate and measured.
I'll start with the good news. The troops who were sent to apprehend me, Linda and Candy, have all been captured. There's no immediate threat to any of us.
For a fleeting moment, a bit of relief crossed the women's faces. Linda let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, and Francine adjusted her posture slightly, though her guard remained up. Knowing that Paul hadn't gotten to the bad part, Linda spoke.
So, what was their mission?
Henry stepped in now, his voice thick with discomfort as the conversation turned darker.
That's the bad news. Their mission was to extract the three of you to be transported to the Pentagon for interrogation.
The tension in the room deepened as Linda's relief turned to apprehension. Francine sat up straighter, her expression quickly morphing from mild anxiety to alarm. Linda asked, her voice raised.
Interrogation?
Francine interjected with a serious question sprinkled with anxiety.
How the hell did they even know Paul, Linda, and Candy were involved?
Paul turned to Linda, lowering his voice slightly.
Linda, do you remember when you offered Chris your phone to call Peter?
Linda froze as everything clicked into place. Francine's expression showed confusion, but Mangino quickly made the connection.
The government must have been monitoring Chris's call to Peter.
Francine was still confused.
But don't they need a warrant for that?
Henry cut in, his voice grim.
Under normal circumstances, yes, but thanks to the Patriot Act and the National Defense Authorization Act, that's not necessary anymore. The government doesn't need evidence to monitor private communications. All they need is suspicion.
Francine clutched the cross around her neck tightly, her anxiety visibly spiking as Major Amma and Mangino shot each other knowing glances. Major Amma, with her history of working closely with the government, visibly stiffened. Now Francine's voice starts trembling.
Something tells me you're not done.
Paul sighed, visibly thoughtful, and it was clear he hated what he was about to say next.
Francine, you might want to brace yourself for this.
Francine's breathing quickened. Linda reached for her hand, but she pulled away and barked loudly at Paul.
Just tell me.
Paul struggled for the words, but Henry stepped in, his tone somber.
The government has labeled Peter, Chris, and Ruby as persons of interest.
The news struck the women like a thunderclap. Linda gasped and brought a hand to her mouth, sinking into her chair. Francine trembled as tears welled up and fell freely down her face. She stared at them as if her worst nightmare had just come true. Major Amma responded, her voice barely a whisper.
Oh no.
She paused, processing the weight of it, her expression tight with concern.
I know exactly what that means.
The room fell silent, the gravity of being labeled persons of interest settling. Francine, with her trembling hands, pulled at her face in anguish. She wasn't just crying, she was unraveling. Linda tried to console her, but for a moment she herself was too afraid to speak. Mangino, standing rigid, finally broke the silence.
When the government labels anyone as a person of interest, it's a slippery slope. They won't stop watching, and if you resist...
She stopped herself, her meaning clear but too heavy to verbalize. Henry continued with hesitancy.
There's more.
Francine snapped, wrestling out of Linda's embrace. Her voice rose to a scream.
More? I don't know how much more I can take.
Paul spoke with compassion.
I know, Francine, and I'm sorry. But as their mother, you need to know this. The government doesn't just see Chris, Ruby, and Peter as threats. They see them as assets. They desperately want them to work for them, to use their intellect for their own ends.
Henry, his voice grim, jumped into the conversation.
And Ruby made it crystal clear she wanted nothing to do with them, nor does Chris. But the government, they don't take rejection lightly.
Major Amma spoke softly, as if speaking to herself.
If the government doesn't get what they want from them, they'll eliminate them.
Francine froze, her entire body shaking. Her eyes widened as rage and fear flooded her face. She screamed, her voice echoing through the command center. Francine is trembling uncontrollably.
The government wants to kill my children. My children.
Her scream caught the attention of everyone in the command center. Analysts and technicians stopped in their tracks, and across the room, Chris, Ruby, Candy, Peter, Jenny, and Charlie immediately sprinted toward her. Francine stood, unhinged, tears streaming, her eyes wild with fury as the others tried to calm her down. Francine focused on Peter as he entered.
This is your fault. My children will lose their futures because of you.
She stormed toward Peter, swinging her fists at him in her anguish.
Ruby is not even 10 years old, and she's on the government's most wanted list. I swear, I will kill you first before I let the government harm them.
The room gasped at the accusation, and even Peter seemed shocked. But then Ruby, trembling but deadly serious, stepped forward.
If you hurt Uncle P, then you're no longer my mother!
Chris grabbed Ruby's arm, yelling at her.
Stop. That's enough.
Candy tried to intervene, her tone pleading.
Ruby, don't say that. You don't mean it.
Ruby yelled with pain in her voice.
Yes, I do!
Chris shouted with authority and force that silenced everyone in the room.
I said enough.
The tension in the room snapped as all attention focused on Chris. He glared at Ruby, his voice forceful and commanding.
Ruby, apologize to Mom. Now!
Ruby crossed her arms, glaring in defiance. Without a word, Chris grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it against a glass window. The window shattered with a loud crash, shocking everyone in the command center. No one dared interrupt him. Chris yelled twice as loudly.
I said apologize now.
Ruby hesitated, then dropped her head, mumbling weakly.
I'm sorry, Mom.
Chris wasn't satisfied.
With sincerity.
Ruby looked up, her voice breaking as true remorse washed over her.
I'm sorry, Mom. Really?
Chris nodded, then turned his attention to Francine and spoke in a commanding manner.
Now you apologize to Uncle Peter and promise not to hurt him.
Francine looked at Peter, her voice soft yet reluctant.
I won't hurt you, I promise.
Chris's tone softened as he turned to the room.
Everyone listen. Ruby and I knew the risks. We decided a long time ago to use what we know to make the world a better place. We know that a revolution's never easy, but they're necessary when those in power overstep. The government fears us and what we are capable of, but if we fall apart now, they'll win.
Candy stepped forward.
Chris is right. We're about to change the course of history, and that's what matters most.
One by one, the team members stood by Chris's side in solidarity, acknowledging his leadership. Mangino, Major Ama, Candy, Jenny, and finally Peter himself. Pride in his eyes. Francine, though still shaken, wiped her tears and hugged Ruby tightly. Unity was restored, and Peter spoke decisively.
From now on, no divisions. We remain united, no matter what. Focus on the mission. Now, let's go get Zeke Haywood.
The command center erupted into energy as everyone prepared for the mission, the room buzzing with determination and resolve.